Contentment, a vampire story. Curtis stood outside the small brick home, his mind racing. The anticipation was killing him. He watched as one by one the lights flicked off, and the darkness of the night filled the structure before him. Biting his bottom lip, he reminded himself that he must be patient. This sort of thing could not be rushed. No, he had to wait until the time was right. Give her a bit to do her routine, and get settled into bed, he thought. Then, and only then, would he make his entrance. As he waited, he allowed his mind to wander. Images of the previous ones came to him. They had all been so beautiful, but one stuck out amongst the rest. She had been a lean brunette with a fiery disposition. Oh, how she had fought against him. Those like her were his favorite. He loathed the ones who wept and pleaded as he stood over them. They were weak in his eyes and brought misery upon themselves by being so. However, despite that, his passion was not derived from the desire to punish others, but rather one for true intimacy. To him, the act of taking a life was the most intimate thing one could do. Copulation failed in comparison to it, as over time it had become devoid of the deeper meaning it had once held. Refocusing on the mission at hand, he made his way to the house. Once at the door, he decided to try his luck and twisted the knob. To his surprise, he found it unlocked. The oddity of such a thing was not lost on him. Anxiety began to build in his chest, and he considered vacating the premises. But his yearning for her kept his feet rooted in place. Swallowing his uneasiness, he slowly pushed the door open, a soft thud breaking the silence as it came to a rest. Cautiously, he ventured forward and immediately regretted doing so. A bulb abruptly clicked to life, illuminating the room and causing him to flinch. There she stood next to an end table, her hands still grasping the dainty chain of the lamp that sat upon it. His eyes met hers, and what he saw chilled him. No fear resided in them. Instead, there was excitement.
"I've been waiting for you,"
the woman said with a grin, her voice rich like honey. Curtis turned to make his escape, but before he could take a step, her arms enveloped him. With strength twice that of his, she held him in place and pressed her lips against his neck, kissing it tenderly before sinking her teeth in deep. Crying out in shock, his body tensed against hers. The pain that came brought with it a terrible heat. He listened as she took in mouthful after mouthful of blood. Delicate moans departed from her as she did so. The sound of her pleasure calmed him, even as his vision began to dim. This, he realized, was what he had been searching for. This was true intimacy. Harold walked into work one day to find his exact double sitting at his desk. His boss was standing next to the new Harold when he noticed the original Harold approaching. "What's going on?" asked the original Harold. "Can't you see?" his boss explained. "You've been replaced by a newer Harold. He'll work a 9-hour shift while you'll only do an 8. Sorry, Harold, but you've been replaced." The original Harold started to panic. He was the breadwinner in the house, and without an income his family would be evicted. They lived on the edge as it was. "I can work harder," the original Harold begged. "I'll do a 9-hour shift starting today." His boss looked at the original Harold. "I can only pay you your current salary, though. You understand?" The original Harold nodded. So the original Harold worked that extra hour, an extra hour he could have spent with his family. Regardless, He still had a job, and it was so hard to find work these days. For that he was thankful. A few weeks later, the new Herald was back at the original Herald's desk. His boss explained that the new Herald had signed up for a 10-hour shift. The original Herald sighed and agreed to do an 11-hour shift for no extra pay. His boss agreed. The original Herald became exhausted, but he still kept food on the table and his family warm during those frequently frozen nights. Then a familiar pattern emerged. Every few weeks the new Herald appeared and said he would work longer than the original Herald. The original Herald gave up his Saturday and soon after sacrificed his Sunday. 11-hour days became 12, 13, 14. For 2 months, the original Herald struggled through 15-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Then he was called into his boss's office. "I'm sorry, Herald, but I'm going to have to let you go. I've had complaints from customers that the quality of your work has slipped." So the original Herald was escorted out of the building. When he got home, he didn't have the heart to tell his family, so they didn't suffer the harsh inevitability of the life that lay ahead. He killed them all while they slept. Then, the original Herald got into his car and drove into a brick wall. He survived, but not in a way that you would consider lucky. His boss heard through the grapevine what had happened and sent the original Herald the cheapest get-well-soon card he could find. The mistake was using company money to buy the card. The next day, his boss came into work to find an exact duplicate of himself sitting at his desk. I loved her, and she loved me. Our love was strong and passionate. She would always look at me with those shining eyes and lovely smile. Her every motion caught my eye, and her sweet lips always a blessing. I loved her with all my heart and all my might from the bottom of the deepest voids of my soul. I would die for her, even kill for her. So, I took care of her problem, a stalker that has been harassing her for some time. She was a gentle soul and was shy to say no. So he took advantage of that and approached her, touching her, breathing on her. Disgusting. I went into hiding as the police started to catch on to me. I wanted to meet her and tell her of my love, but I couldn't risk being traced. So I just watched her from afar. My angel. She looked sad and distraught. The pain of parting with me had broken her heart, as it did mine. Such sweet love. I did it for you, my love. Months pass, and I wait around the corner just to see her face, to catch a glimpse. It was getting late, and she hasn't arrived yet. It's around 9 p.m., so she's probably out, drinking at that bar across her workplace, with her female co-worker Becky, and then try to walk it off a bit before catching a cab home. I just noticed that she left the window to her room on the second floor ajar as she usually does, typical of her. It's almost 11 p.m., and I see her arrive not in a cab, but in a car I have never seen before. A slender man had driven her. Another disgusting predator looking to score with my love. How dare he? Again, she is too shy to say no. Her fake smile and gentle gestures always confuses them as a signal to approach. But I'll show him. I'll show them all that she has a man. Me, I'll take out that garbage for her. Such innocence. It can't be helped. It's not her fault. She's probably scared under that pretending smile. Weeks after I took care of that no-good predator, that was taking advantage of my beloved Kent. Now the police have swarmed the place. A patrol car looks vigilant around the block, probably looking for me. Today I made a brief eye contact with her. She looked worried. Worried for my safety probably, as she quickly went inside her house. Probably the police was near her, and she wanted to prevent their attention. Such love. Though brief, we understood each other. We are connected that way. Tonight, I'll take her with me to a safer place, where no one can come between us again. Then we will be together forever. I creep up to her house as the patrol car makes their rounds and drives away. The window of her second-floor bedroom is ajar as always. Probably for me to come in easily. She's thoughtful like that. I creep in to see if any cops are inside the house. Luckily, she's alone. Perfect. I make my way to her bedroom to find her fast asleep. Her beautiful face is angelic as ever. How I love her so. I wake her up to take her with me. She is startled and is delirious, fighting me and struggling. She thinks I'm one of her stalkers. Poor darling. My angel. You won't ever need to be afraid again. But she doesn't recognize me or listens to reason. Time is running out, and I had no choice but to incapacitate her. She'll understand later. I take her to my car, and we speed off into the night. Such cliché. It's funny, but romantic, I guess. 3 days have passed and my love is still fighting me. Persistent in thinking I am a stalker and a monster. What have they done to her? No longer was the loving smile that used to bless me, and dull are those once shining eyes. They have corrupted her, brainwashed her against me. The police, they did this to her to get me. Or it must be that shrink that she's been seeing. He probably took advantage of her vulnerable state and brainwashed her to take her himself. That monster. I must have him undo the damage. They cut me. They were waiting for me at that shrink's office. How did they know? This must have been a trap set by that evil doctor. Even the police don't believe me. The shrink pinned a psychopath stalker tag on me. How dare he pin everything on me? The police held me in their interrogation room to tell them where I hid my beloved. But I won't break. I will not have them hand her over to that monster, so he could have his way. Never. I'd burn in hell rather than betray her. I was sentenced to double life, without possibility of parole. They've succeeded in caging me, but they will never get me to betray the location of my love. Tonight, after much planning, I shall be free from this physical barrier that has prevented me from joining my love. No one will be able to stop me. We will be joined again by our souls. It was late in the 21st century that humanity discovered magic. 8 left. It was found, quite accidentally, that a certain array of symbols, carved or drawn on a flat surface, could be used to work wonders and grant wishes. 7 left now. Wealth, food, superpowers, healing, you name it, and with a bit of willpower and time, it was yours. The world changed overnight. Only 5 now. But nothing comes for free. Scientists quickly noticed that stars were vanishing, as if they never existed. Gone in an instant. For now. Eventually they found that each wish burned out a single star, so long as that star was visible from Earth. Multiply that by billions of wishes daily, and the sky got empty real quick. Of course, nobody stopped wishing. Greed ruled us, even if there was a heft cost. Tonight, there's only 3 left. 2 now. As the nights grew darker, people started vanishing too. Supernatural things were what people blamed. Ghosts, vampires, Bigfoot, anything but themselves. The darker it got, the more people disappeared. Nobody knows what takes them. 1 second there, and the next, they're gone. Only one lonely star left. I pity her. Last of her kind. All destroyed by us. Sad. I'm one of maybe 10 people left in my city. The rest have all been taken. Bright light keeps us safe, so as long as we work during daylight, we should survive. I'll probably close up this recording now. I just want a testament of what happened to be known. Maybe some future generation will find this and know why they must live in darkness. And there she goes. The last star, gone without a trace. Snuffed out for a selfish wish. Real pretty moon tonight. I suppose that will always light up the sky, even if Luna is all alone now. Wait, it was there just a second ago.
Good evening, all my children of the night. It is I, Count Mo. Tonight, I bring you the finest tales from Reddit's No Sleep subreddit. So sit back, relax, and let this dark veil fall about you as we delve into another spooky tale.
I looked at the computer screen, making sure that everything was in place for tonight's reading as a few more regulars popped into the chat. I had 35 so far, the same 35 that showed up with some regularity. But I could draw as many as 100 at a time before the story was over. That may not seem like many, but considering that I wasn't sitting half-naked in front of my camera or giving away lavish prizes, I considered my readings to be pretty well attended. I'd only been reading my stories on YouTube for about a year when one of them took off like a shot, and I finally crossed the threshold into 1,000 subscribers. That was about the time I started adding a live reading of a random story every week. Just something to help promote a random Reddit writer, so they too might benefit from having their stories heard by my limited audience. I was sitting in my favorite chair, cape drawn around my velvet top, my hair gleaming from the product used to keep it down, and my fake vampire teeth, making my voice sound thick and slurry. This was my costume, Count Mo, and it was probably about as original as the ideas from the stories I read. If they could see the pajama pants I was wearing out of the camera, I'm sure the illusion that I was a real vampire reading internet stories in his lair would be ruined. Something made a sound in the room behind me, sounding like it had rustled something in the closet. But I just figured it was Chester, my big orange tomcat. It made me look away for a moment, casting my eyes into the darkroom beyond the cover of my green screen, which I'd covered with an old tapestry from Party City. The blackout curtains kept even the street lights from ruining my ambience, and the hour at which I always did these streams made for a room as dark as pitch. The glow of my computer monitor was the only light present, and it lit my face wetly as I turned back to the screen. I could see my image in the little window box, the playback tab, as it recorded, and I suddenly turned back and spat the teeth onto the desk with a flourish. This was another part of my intro, the losing of the teeth, since they made it almost impossible to read understandably.
Now then,
I said, smiling normally,
let's start tonight's show. Tonight, we will be reading Voices in the Woods by user Fost Cinema.
Jesus, where do they come up with these usernames?
Well, then, my children of the night, let us begin.
I looked over to the other tab, finding the story and starting at the beginning to read. Before starting tonight's stream, I had read through it a few times, familiarizing myself with the tale. It was a pretty predictable little story, scouts in the woods, harassed by a monster, and I was pretty confident that I could read it without stumbling too hard over the words. There was nothing worse than watching someone read over a stream and having to suffer through them constantly muddying the words. I heard something creak its way through the closet door, but put it off as Chester again.
It was just supposed to be a typical camping trip, with my scout troop. Davy, Kevin, and I were so excited. We always looked forward to these camping trips, and the yearly spring campout was one of the best. All the scouts would set up near Gracieson Falls, and there we would meet with the 5 other local troops for the Yambori. There would be canoeing and races and s'mores and, of course, the annual scary story contest. We set up our...
I heard the noise again, this time a little louder than before. It sounded like something pushing the closet door open. For some reason, the vent in my apartment is in the closet, so I always leave it cracked for suitable ventilation. I tried not to hiss under my breath at Chester as he came out of my closet, probably sleeping in a pile of my dirty clothes again, since now my stream would be inundated with the sound of my AC running.
We set up our tent a little further back than the others, Scoutmaster Larry giving us a set area where we could pitch our tents. No sooner had I picked a spot when Davy hissed at me to follow them into the woods, but Scoutmaster Larry said,
I heard the springs creak as that big old Tom of mine jumped up onto the bed, and I decided that it might be time for a diet. He sounded like he may have gained some weight over the last couple of feedings.
Who cares what Scoutmaster Larry said? Do you want to camp or what? So we set my tent up there as a decoy and moved off into the woods as I followed Davy to the place where Kevin was setting up our campsite. But what if they look for us? I asked. Davy just waves his hand at my question. We'll go back to eat, and then after dinner, we'll head back to the site. We'll wake up before anyone gets good and stirring tomorrow, and be back in the camp before they notice anything.
I was trying to maintain eye contact with the camera, but something was making the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It felt like someone was watching me with an intense level of scrutiny, and it was really throwing me off. I reached down to have a sip of my water and decided to power through the stream. It was just Chester, after all. He was just being a dumb cat.
So the scouts went to their secret camp in the woods, and the storyteller admitted that it was pretty cool. They set up their own fire pit, got their own water, and were prepared for the night when they left to rejoin the scout troop. The rest of the day proceeded normally. A meal was served, some announcements were made, and then everyone left to go tuck in for the night.
As I read this out, I could see myself getting more and more anxious in the after image on my computer. I was stumbling about 3 words a paragraph, and I considered going over to the bed to put Chester out. I didn't want to mess up the stream though, and so I took another sip of water and tried to power through it. When I reached for the cup, apologizing to my audience for the small break, my foot moved and touched something soft and warm under my desk. I thought it might have been a slipper, but then it rolled over, wrapping its little paws around my foot. I looked down, nearly spilling my water as I caught sight of Chester as he wrapped his sleepy little paws around my foot. I felt a chill slide up my neck. If Chester was here, then who was on my bed? I glanced up at the reverse image on my webcam, trying to probe the darkness, and wished to Christ I hadn't. Something was staring at me from that midnight gulf, a distance of 10 feet, that might as well have been an endless sea. Its eyes looked huge, two round eggs that were laser-focused on the back of my head. The room was too dark for me to see much, but it was enough to make me very nervous. I realized I had been quiet for nearly 3 minutes as I looked at the eyes and pondered my safety, and the chat was starting to wonder what was happening.
Sorry, folks, I was wool gathering for a minute. Let's get back to the story.
As I read, I began to make my plan. I couldn't just bolt for the door, it would probably get me. I could push the screen over on top of it and run, but that would also be a great way to get shredded. I had no clue what it was, so fighting it was probably right out too. So, I thought, what the hell was I going to do? As I read, I noticed that it just sat there, staring, not moving, and seemed to be listening. Maybe, if I kept reading like I didn't notice it, the thing would go away. All kinds of nasty things were just waiting for you to notice them, so they could kill you. If I could maintain my pace and just power through the story, maybe it would go away on its own. I told them about how the children had descended into the woods, looking for their campsite.
As we went, I began to saw something in the trees. The others could hear it too, that much was obvious, but they were pretending they couldn't. We could all hear the sounds of animals as they moved about us, bear and deer, and raccoon and bird. Many of the birds didn't even appear at night, but their voices were raised in chorus as they vied for our attention. When we reached the tent, we all went straight in, not daring to even sit by the fire we had built up to use that night.
I heard the springs creak as it moved atop the bed. Was it getting closer? Was it leaving? I looked at the monitor, struggling to keep reading, as I saw those eyes coming towards the edge of the bed, the edge closest to the computer. I gulped. It was coming closer.
Suddenly, we were awakened from sleep by the familiar sounds of voices.
I heard it as it jumped onto the floor beside my bed.
They were familiar voices. Campers and Scout masters they knew could be heard in the wall. They were looking for them, searching for them, trying to find them, as their voices clattered through the dark wilderness. Davy opened the tent, looking out into the darkness, but Kevin seemed scared as the voices grew closer and closer. Maybe we should just go to them, guys. They're going to be mad if they find our tent out here. We can just say we're out here using the bathroom.
The carpet made an almost angry sound as the creature's feet dug into it, and I heard my stutter becoming more pronounced as the fear washed over me. It was coming closer. I could smell it. It smelled like blood.
Davy turned. Are you crazy? If we stay right where we are, they'll never find us. But Kevin didn't seem so sure. As we stood at the tent flap, Kevin finally bolted, running into the woods, yelling that he was sorry for Mama, making them look for him. His yells were cut off suddenly, very suddenly, and Davy and I just stood there as we looked out into the woods.
It was taller than I had thought it would be. I was picturing something the size of Chester, but this thing was almost as tall as I was sitting. I could still only see those eyes as it moved towards me, but as it came closer to the monitor, I could see more. Its face was skeletal, its eyes looking like Halloween props shoved into a bleached dog's skull. Its jaws clacked a little as it walked, and though it was too far to my left to be seen by the reverse camera, I could see it just fine in my peripheral. I could see it too well, in fact.
Davy and I stood, looking out into the woods. The voices were still there, still calling, but now Kevin's voice had joined them.
I was yelling, almost screaming, as the thing's wet breath puffed against my ear. I didn't dare stop. I didn't dare look at the live chat to see what anyone made of this weird little performance. I just read the story, wondering if the story had become a ticking clock for my own life. I had hoped it would leave, but what if it didn't?
Davy, I said, the other Bobo boy turning to look at me. If they're all out here looking for us, why don't they have flashlights? Davy contemplated this, and it seemed to scare him just as much as it did me.
I shuddered, closing my eyes as I felt a puff of air on my cheek. The air was acrid, like sulfur, and I felt my teeth clacking together as I tried to retain the threads of my story. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't let it end this way. What would people think when I suddenly got mauled to death by this thing? That's when it hit me. There would be some record of this. I was still recording. I was still. The red light on my camera was off. My blood ran cold. How long had it been since I stopped recording? The box would still show me the after image, recording or not. So I had no clue how long that camera had been off. Had I just stopped in the middle of my story? I couldn't very well check with the pestilential creature in my ear. It was, after all, my only audience now. Perhaps, I thought with a shudder, my last audience. It growled softly, and I read on, extending my life for the length of this creator's contribution.
We went back inside, huddling in our tent, as the voices grew closer and closer.
I was yelling out of pure habit now, just trying to drown out my fear as much as the sounds its bony jaws were making.
They kept calling out names, as the voices came closer and closer.
I could feel the tears running down my face as my fear grew in intensity.
I was crying, huddled in my sleeping bag, as Davy shuddered beside me, the voices growing closer and closer.
Its breath was puffing in my ear, and I was shaking so hard that the words on the screen had begun to vibrate through my tears.
I jumped when I heard the zipper open, looking up to see Davy as he stepped out into the night, looking back only once as the voices seemed to surround the tent. As he left, I heard him scream. It was long and high, and it cut through the monotonous tone of the things grouped outside my tent. It ended suddenly, cut off as though choked out of him before his own voice joined that hellish choir.
Its eyes were boring into me, and I wished that, if it meant to kill me, it would just do it. I suddenly knew how the boy in the story felt, menaced by forces outside his control and his understanding. Except, he had been spared having to see his hellish pursuers. I was eye to eye with mine, as it waited for the thrilling climax, before it pounced and brought about my end.
Suddenly, they surrounded the tent, pushing and shoving and bending the walls with their bony hands. They pushed faces against the fabric, and I could see their terrible features as they longed for what lay within. Adults, children, animals, all of them seeming to be little more than skeletons as they menaced me. I zipped my sleeping bag up and lay shivering at the bow bottom as I blocked it all out, wishing it would end quickly.
I was nearly screaming now, snot running down my face as tears flowed down my cheeks in rivulets, making my white vampire makeup run.
Suddenly, I could feel them around me, surrounding my sleeping bag, pushing against the fabric. As I screamed and shivered in my bag, I heard the spidery sound of the zipper coming down.
The creature opened its jaws, its sulfur breath puffing against my cheek.
The sound of monotonous voices calling me in their unchanging tone.
I heard a growl begin in its throat.
It did its sank its face into the mouth of the sleeping bag, and I saw its bony face as it looked in at me.
Its body tenses, its two long legs holding up a body I could now see was the size of a large dog. I had glanced now and saw that it was like a rotten Doberman on somehow comical paper steamer legs. They were segmented and jointed oddly, like a Tim Burton nightmare creature. As I looked at it, breaking the cardinal rule, I growled hugely, sounding like a dog with a foghorn stuck in its throat. I screamed, then, eyes wide as it reeled back on those ridiculous legs and lunged at me, its mouth full of sharp, bony teeth coming straight for my face. Then, suddenly, the lights came on. I blinked, eyes watering as I was momentarily blinded. When my eyes adjusted, it was gone.
Look, I know you're doing your little show in here, but could you keep it down, dude? I've got to work in the morning, and the reading usually doesn't bother me, but the yelling has got to. Dude, are you okay?
It was Reggie, my roommate. He was dressed in pajama bottoms and a sleeveless tee, and he suddenly looked like the most extraordinary person in the world to me. He must have thought I was yelling for dramatic effect and come to tell me off. One look at my tear-stained face and double snot runners, though, and he probably thought I was crazy. I wiped my face, telling him it was okay now and I must have dozed off and been having a nightmare. He told me it was cool and left to get back to bed, jumping a little as I screamed when he tried to turn off the lights. That was 2 weeks ago now. I haven't turned the lights off in that room since. Whether I'm there or not, I always keep the lights on. I don't go out after dark anymore either, not even with a flashlight. I looked at the footage from the stream and found that it cut out just about the time the creature climbed off the bed. You can't see anything, not even the eyes, but I deleted the footage anyway. Just watching it gives me the creeps. I had to bury Chester as well. The second discovery that night was that the poor little guy had died right under my computer desk. His eyes were open, and he looked like he'd seen just about the most terrifying thing imaginable. The vet cremated him for me after saying it appeared his heart had just stopped. I put him in a showbox and buried him outside by a big oak tree. I haven't even thought about getting another cat. People complain about my streams now. They say that the lights being on kills the ambience, but I don't care. I won't sit in the dark there anymore. I don't know if it being there was a fluke or if it was attracted out by that night's story, and I don't want to find out. I know it hates the light, so the lights stay on. Krista sighed as she watched the water gurgle on the rocks in the stream. There it goes, she said as she tried to follow the water downstream with her eyes, off to somewhere new and more exciting. What was that, Krista? Her brother Ella said. He was too busy being lost in the clouds to pay any attention to what his sister was complaining about. The only reason he asked her to repeat it was on the off chance that it pertained to him. Oh, nothing, Krista said. It's just so boring out here. There's never anything to do. No excitement. I miss the city. Krista and her brother had grown up in the lively street of the city. There was always new people to meet and new things to do. Her father was a carriage driver for the royal house. Or at least, he was until recently. He had saved up enough money to retire off into the country and live a quiet, peaceful life with his family. Although it was wrong, Krista sometimes wished her father has been a less successful man. She enjoyed the city life, and was not adjusting well to her new slower-paced way of living. She missed her friends and, frankly, she missed not being so damn bored all the time. Ella lowered his gaze from the sky to the empty pail lay on the ground next to him. Well, I guess we should head back before Mom gets too upset and comes looking for us. He grabs the pail and proceeds to fill it with fresh water from the stream. Come on, Krista, we have to start heading back before the sun sets. Krista slowly rises to her feet and hangs her head down in an exaggerated fashion, swinging her arms side to side as they walk back. Every day is the same, she said. We do chores, we go for a walk, then it's back to more chores. Well, at least we have a fine view out here, Ella remarked. I don't want a fine view. I want to be back in the city, exploring the markets, eating new and tasty foods, and talking with my friends. It isn't all bad out here, he rebutted. We can go hunting, fishing, and even riding when Father isn't using the horses. Those sound like things you want to do, Ella. I'm not a young boy. I am growing into a woman now. We have different priorities. Ella just rolled his eyes. He knew what was coming next. I'm almost 15 now, you know. We need to go back to the city so I can find a husband. If we stayed out here, I'd be forced to marry a goat. How? Can you imagine? No. I want a high-born boy with golden hair and dark green eyes. There's no one like that out here. And our trips to the city are so brief, I never have to meet anyone. I simply must convince Father to move back to the city, or at least let me stay with one of our relatives. I mean, our family line is at stake here. Would you be quiet? Ella snapped. This fantasizing about the city was a daily occurrence for his sister now, and it was becoming entirely too much to bear. Let's just shut our mouths and enjoy this boring view until we get home. The two siblings did just that. Their homestead was around 10 miles from the stream. But since the land was relatively flat and mostly tamed, the youthful boy and the almost woman had no trouble making this traversal several times a week. The wind and their footsteps had a lovely conversation as the two casually paced through the lavender fields that surrounded their home. Once the stream was out of sight, it felt like they stretched forever and ever. The late afternoon sun cast golden rays on the backside of the purple petals. This delightful sight, paired with the rustling of the lavender by the breeze, almost made Krista forget her boredom. Ella always enjoyed these quiet walks home. He would let his mind wander and come up with fantastical stories about the clouds or happenings in the trees in the far distance. He often conjured a family of raccoons that lived in those faraway woods. Their daily mundane struggles were clear in his mind and helped him ignore his sister on those walks where she refused to be quiet. Today, though, the walk was quiet, and he was happy about that. About halfway home, Ella began to be pulled out of his fantasies by the sloshing of the water in the pail. He had been mindlessly transferring it from one hand to another when his arm would tire, but now he was close to his limit. He set the bucket down and massaged his palms. Their ache began to fade, and around that time Krista realized her brother was no longer beside her. She turned back and saw him standing there rubbing his hands. Come on, Ella. We have to make it back before the sun sets. You know the rules. Ella sighed and once again picked up his burden, then made his way to catch up with his sister. You know how Mother gets if we aren't back before it gets dark. We won't be allowed to leave the house for a week. Ella looked behind him and saw the dusk sun fading behind the horizon. He begrudgingly agreed, and the two quickened their pace. As the last rays of sun shined upon them, they reached the hill that their home lay just on the other side of. The siblings were out of breath and panting by this point. Heartbeats pounded in their ears, and they didn't even hear the horse galloping up the hill from the opposite side. They both reached the climax of the hill at the same time, and as Ella lifted his head to look at their house, all he saw the chest of their father's horse, at full gallop headed directly for him. Ella threw his body out of the way, but he wasn't quick enough to avoid the horse entirely. The animal struck his right shoulder at full speed and sent his arm and the pail of water flying backwards. Ella cried out in pain as he felt his arm dislocate and his chest muscles stretched too far. As soon as his body hit the ground, he was groaning and gritting his teeth in agony. Ella, Krista called out and rushed to her brother's side. "Are you okay? Where are you hurt?" Ella was sucking in sharp, stuttering breaths through his teeth. "My arm, stupid horse. What the hell was it doing?" His sister attempted to help him to his feet so they could get back home and get help. "Well, good job protecting the water," Krista remarked, trying to distract her brother from the pain. Ella tried to chuckle, but all that came out was a sharp exhale. The 200 or so yards back to their house felt longer than the whole 10 miles they had just traveled. As they approached, Krista knew something was wrong. The wagon containing the day's harvest of lavender was turned over, with a broken wheel looking like something had knocked it over. The fence surrounding their barn was open, and their goats were out grazing in the garden, where they were not supposed to be. The front of the house looked awfully dark, and Krista realized the lantern that her mother usually hung on the porch when the siblings were out past dark was laying on the ground next to the gate with a small fire from the oil burning around it. Krista also noticed something else. A body. It looked like her mother's body lying a few feet past the gate, but something was off about it. His stomach dropped when she realized what she was looking at. Her mother's body was lying on its back, but her mother's head was face first in the dirt. This sight was too much for her to handle. She needed comfort. She needed someone to tell her what was going on. Instinctually, she began looking for her father. Luckily, Ella was in too much pain to comprehend what was going on. She propped him against the wagon and told him she was going to find their father. She was hyperventilating and holding back tears as she sprinted towards the house. She forced her neck left, which made it awkward to run, but kept her from looking at the contorted neck of her mother. Something had gone terribly wrong. Then a thought popped into her mind, and she stopped cold in her tracks. Someone killed her mother. Someone had possibly killed her father too. They could be waiting for her in the house. What the hell is happening? She thought to herself as she tried to gain some sort of sanity. She needed to calm down and figure out what the situation was. Slowly, Krista crouched along the side of her house to the window that looked into the living room. As she rose to look into the window, she saw claw marks leading up to the window ledge. Oh no, she thought. A cougar had gotten in and attacked her parents. It must have chased their mother outside and broken her neck. She expected her father to be mauled with claw marks all over his body. For the rest of her life, she would wish that is what she saw. But it isn't what she saw at all. She didn't even notice the blood. She expected blood. She did not expect parts. Parts of what used to be her father, were scattered all across the living room. There were hunks of flesh scattered by the fireplace. His jaw with teeth still attached was resting on the dining table. Something had ripped the jaw off of his body. She could still see the unshaven stubble on parts where there was still skin. The rest of his head was sitting on a chair. The eyes was gouged out. She almost couldn't comprehend what she was looking at. It was too much. She felt numb until she saw movement. A dark shadow flicked down the hallway and caught her attention. As her head whipped sideways towards the movement, her stomach dropped. This wild animal that killed her parents was still here, and she had no way of escaping. The horses were gone, and she knew Ella was too injured to run. She would have to kill this animal, or it would kill her. She moved back to the porch and grabbed her brother's training sword. It wasn't sharp, but it was the only weapon she had access to outside of the house. From the porch, she caught a glimpse of Ella still leaning on the wagon. She knew she had to fix his arm soon, but it would have to wait until the imminent threat was dealt with. Crouching as low as she could, she made her way to the bedroom window. From here, she would be able to see the creature and decide the best way to attack it. It was completely dark outside at this point, but there was still a fire burning in the fireplace and a candle in the hallway, so the house had some light in it. Krista's entire body was shaking violently. Both of her parents had been killed, and now she was the only thing standing between life and death for her and her brother. She took a few deep breaths and rose to see the villain that had killed her family. She did not see what she expected to see, but what was worse was what she heard. The sucking and popping sound her father's femur made when it was dislodged from his hip made her tongue retreat to the back of her throat, and a guttural sound escaped her mouth. She couldn't help but vomit after the sight of the creature snapping open the bloody bone and sucking out the marrow with a wet slurping sound. After a minute or so of gagging and vomiting, she somehow managed to breathe and rise to her feet. Krista was no longer aware of her surroundings. This had all happened so fast, and all she knew was that she needed to leave, get her brother, and somehow make it to the city. They could find someone on horseback or make it to the river and get on someone's boat. Anything, just something to get her away from here. She lifted her head, and her entire body stiffened. Every cell she was composed of at that moment stopped, and her world went blank with everything but one emotion: fear. Inches from her face, staring at her, was the creature. Two large glowing yellow eyes were looking into hers, unblinking and unyielding. Not a thought passed through her mind for those long seconds. No thought of running away or swinging the sword she held in her hand. Nothing, just pure fear. The creature lifted a claw that was still wet with the blood of her father and reached out to touch Krista. Just before it grabbed her by the neck, she heard the most terrible noise. "Mom!" Ella screeched, his adolescent voice cracking as he reached decibels that were beyond his age. "No, Mom. Krista, help, it's Mom. She needs help." Ella continued to yell, and Krista heard him running into the field, where their dead mother lay. The creature whipped its head around and scurried down the hall and out the front door towards her brother. She caught a glimpse of the old black skin that had been hidden in the darkness of the bedroom. She noticed how unnaturally the creature moved for being so lanky. "No," she sobbed in a deep and hopeless voice. "No, no, 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 no." She continued as she rounded the house and saw in the darkness the shadowy creature bound across the yard at too fast a pace. She didn't even have time to call out to her brother before it was on him. She heard him screech as the creature pounced on him, and she dropped to her knees as his high-pitched cries turned guttural and liquid. At that moment, she knew her brother was dead. Krista wanted to die right there, just give up on life and drop dead, but she knew that wouldn't happen. Death would not come so easily and so painlessly. She had two options, two primal options. She could stand and fight. She knew this was a poor option. Her brother's trying sword wasn't sharp enough to cut human skin, much less that thing. Also, it had killed her father and mother, who were both stronger than she was. So, fighting was a no-go. Her other option was to run, and she hated this option just as much. Running from what seemed like an inevitable demise felt worse than walking right up to the creature and exposing her neck. The thought of that beast running her down was paralyzing. She had seen how fast and unnaturally it moved, and wanted no part in having a foot race with it. On the other hand, what choice did she have? Perhaps the creature wasn't that keen on catching her. It had already killed 3 members of her family. How much more could it want? She knew if she tried to hide in the house, it would find her when it came back to finish feasting on her father. With 2 deep breaths and shaky knees, she started off into the night. The closest neighbors were 40 miles away on the next farm. Not to mention, she would have to pass through 10 miles of dense forest to reach them. Even if she did reach them, then what? She would just get slaughtered there. The only real option was the run west. There was a trading post 60 miles west. Then, from there, she could catch a wagon and make it to the city and tell the authorities what happened. Krista knew there were people trained to handle such matters. She couldn't bring her family back to life, but at the very least, she could avenge them. Panting and exhausted, Krista collapsed after running for 10 miles. It was just too much. She had run out of adrenaline and could hardly move her limbs. Wheezing and coughing, she tried her best to catch her breath, but it was clear she was spent. Everything hurt, and her head was pounding. As she reached her hand out, she touched something cold and wet. It was the stream. This was as far as she made it, back to where she started. Krista rolled her body closer to the water and took a few sips of water. It was the best drink of water she had ever had. She laid her head in the water and let the cool liquid flow through her hair. A sharp breath startled her as she realized she had her head underwater for too long. A rustle made her realize that she had just left her head underwater for the rest of her life. There's no way it followed me, she thought. But it had followed her, tracked her all the way to the stream, and was now searching for her in the moonlight. Krista flattened her body as much as she could and took shallow breaths. Her body yearned for oxygen, but she held back. Slow, soft breaths were all she took. The monster skittered about in a way that terrified her more than the sight of her dead mother. It was so fast, so unpredictable, so unnatural. She hated this monster. It had taken everything from her, and now it darted back and forth along the water's edge, looking for her. Just do it. Find me already, she thought to herself. The anticipation of hiding and waiting was too much for her. It had been hours of non-stop tension now, and she just wanted it to end. A loud crash of something heavy into the water near her startled Krista. It took everything. She had not to jump, but all the hairs on her body stood up at once. She was not keenly aware of everything, all senses on high alert. With a cry, she jolted up to her feet and faced the creature. She realized her hands were empty. She dropped the sword at some point when she was running, but it didn't matter. Krista could not cower anymore. The creature noticed its foe standing in front of it and stood straight up and let out a piercing cry towards the moon. This cry sucked all of the courage from Krista's heart. It was clear she was outmatched and once again remembered what terror was. Her knees became weak and she dropped down, holding up her hands to defend herself. The creature lifted a large stone from the river and hurled it at Krista. The stone flew past Krista's hand and impaled itself into the crown of her head. With a thud, she dropped into the stream, and her dead eyes watched her blood flow down the stream, off to somewhere new and less exciting.
Please subscribe, or the toxic skull will come for you.